Well, we heard three very interesting presentations. They could generate a very lively discussion. So many interesting topics were raised by the speakers. Unfortunately, we don't have much time for the discussion that these presentations deserve, but perhaps we can invade a little bit the time allocated for the lunch break, so that we can hear at least a number of comments and questions. בבקשה.
I am perturbed by three questions that are interrelated. The intervention into the diaspora, the minority in another country, can be seen as meddling in foreign countries' affairs, but can be also seen as an instrument of democratization outside in. Secondly, it would be very interesting for the younger researcher to open perhaps a chapter about diasporas as minorities. The complexity of the diaspora as a minority is dual. How do Turks affect Turkish politics from Germany? And what do Turks in Germany represent as German citizens? Similarly, on a religious basis, Armenian, Jewish, etc. diasporas. That's one thing. Secondly, really the final aspect that is maybe more crucial to me, what does this say about democracy in the Middle East? And how will Israel as a democratic state survive in a sea of minority special interests that, for the many valid reasons exposed, make democracy impossible? So in the short term and in the longer term, there is this question of the outside minority, how they could influence democracy in the mother country, and the divisions within the state, sectarian, etc., toward a democratization. And if this is not achieved, how does Israel fit in the picture as a democratic state?
Thank you very much. Please.
I have a question for Professor Susser. You know, sometimes the religious minority...
Take the micro.
Thank you. Sorry. I have a question for Professor Susser. Do you think sometimes religious minority jumps over the vehicle of Arab nationalism in order to get secure, to be more secure, like we saw that Shibli al-Aysami and Michel Aflaq, they jumped over Ba'ath and they created Ba'ath Party in Syria and Iraq? That's a sort of protection or modernization? Thank you.
Thank you. More questions or comments? I don't see anybody. Yes, בבקשה.
First of all, thank you very much. One thing that came to mind was the connection between the 19th century colonial efforts to locate a minority and protect it that Professor Rabinovich mentioned. For instance, the fact that different empires at that time chose different minorities seems like it was a more effective strategy, whereas, as Dr. Hazran mentions, Israel sort of chose all the minorities and didn't actually succeed with any particular minority. I think it raises an interesting question.
It succeeded with the Druze.
Except for
In Israel.
Most of the Druze in Israel
Yes.
have successfully become a part of the Zionist enterprise, if you will. But I think it raises an interesting question as to whether Israel was perhaps continuing this idea of finding a minority to patronize as a tool, and whether perhaps in retrospect we could maybe ask that the fact that Israel didn't have necessarily a personal vested interest in, say, for instance, the success of the Maronites, whereas the French did have a vested interest in the success of the Maronites because they viewed them as fellow brothers, as fellow Catholics in sort of the same boat. Israel was sort of, let's help these guys because they need help. Not so much let's help them because they're actually part of our struggle. And I wonder if maybe this was that Israel, if Israel maybe never had a sort of vested interest in helping some of these minorities, it was sort of a, by the way, if we could help them, it would be nice kind of thing. If either of you have a comment on that, Professor Rabinovich or Yusri Hazran.
Any more? Well, we have already a number of questions relating to mostly to the place of Israel in this mosaic of minorities. I think this was a term coined by Abba Ibn at the time, Middle East, as a mosaic of minorities, and of course the place of democracy in this context. So I invite the panelists to respond, and they may also relate to each other's presentations. Please, Itamar, be the first.
Okay. First of all, one major exception is Israel and the Armenians. I think Dr. Hazran said that Israel was interested, all minority, not the Armenians.
No, I didn't mention the Armenians.
No, I said you didn't mention that because
Cases.
there never was a warm, friendly relationship between Israel and the Armenians.
Copts.
Pardon?
Also the Copts in Egypt.
Yeah, but Armenians tended to identify, let's say in the Palestinian context, with the Arab side. To date, you still have in the PLO several individuals with Armenian names who there is sort of an underlying tension over the very use of the term Holocaust by the Armenians, which the Jews in a way resent. I can mention in this context that Bernard Lewis was sued in France by the Armenian community for an interview he gave to Le Monde in which he spoke about the Armenian massacres or genocide, and he was sued under a law enacted in France in order to prevent Holocaust denial, our quote-unquote, our Holocaust. He lost the case. Pardon?
The real Holocaust.
Yeah, the real. He was found guilty and fined €1 or €1 and never set foot in France again. So the Armenians definitely are not part of that. Second, the Maronites, as documented in Laura Eisenberg's book and other cases. There was a long history. The collaboration ended with a semi-friendly testimony by the Maronite Patriarch to the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry that was to decide about the future of Palestine. In the 50s, there were some awkward events. There's the famous quote from Ben-Gurion in Moshe Sharet's personal diaries about trying to stage a revolution in Lebanon and turn it into a Christian-friendly state. There's a very good piece by Benny Morris who used it and used also a very perceptive memorandum written by Gideon Tadmor, who was a Foreign Office diplomat, who wrote a very perceptive memorandum saying that it was useless. There was no time. There was no point in investing. And then what happened on the eve of the 82 war, both individuals in the Mossad believed in this alliance, and Begin had sort of a complex. He said, we, the Jews who were so persecuted, would be in a position to help another persecuted minority. It was an emotional element in Begin's makeup that led to this very ruinous, unproductive partnership that ended in the fiasco, I would say, of 1982. Finally, one interesting dimension is the relationship between the Canaanite movement in sort of the late 40s and early 50s, and some of the Maronites, some of the people with the Phoenician. We have Professor Salame here, who is the expert on the Phoenician movement. So between Canaanites and Phoenicians, both there was a certain affinity. And after between 82 and 84, the home of Aaron Amir was the Israeli poet and Canaanite thinker. Many sort of radical Maronites used to come here, and became an interesting place where Canaanites and Maronite nationalists used to confer.
Thank you, Itamar. Asher, briefly, if possible.
Well, I'll three very brief comments. I don't think the outside diasporas have much influence in their original countries. If I think about the Turks or about the Jews or the Maronites, democracy in the Middle East, I wouldn't put too much faith in that, obviously. But I do think, because of the importance of minorities and sectarian groups, that if there is a possibility for some kind of pluralism, it would be an agreed confessional pluralism. That would be a kind of Middle Eastern democracy which could possibly work. It worked for a while in Lebanon. It may work again. You mentioned Israel as a democracy. It still is. The emphasis on the still, and I suggest that we not, blow this up a little more than it deserves, as the only democracy in the region. Then there was a question that was directed to me directly, and if I understood you correctly, you spoke about Christian ideologues for whom Arab nationalism was a vehicle to escape religious minority inferiority politically. I think that this was definitely intended to be a form of protection. And I think the fact that the Christian minorities did play such a prominent role in the advent of Arab nationalism is a reflection of that. But it didn't work. It did not work. Arabism did not deliver, because Arabism was never as secular as it ought to have been, and the end result was a failure of Arab nationalism as this secularizing platform which they had hoped it would be. And a comment that I make to Yusri, you spoke about the position of Avram Sela and Eyal Zisser, who speak in a kind of a diminutive fashion about this Israeli minority policy. I must confess I am with them. I think this was much more a question of Israel trying to exploit opportunities that arose here and there, rather than some grand design. Israel could be with the Kurds one day and against the Kurds another day, depending on what Israel's interests were at any given moment. And depending on Israel's relations with Turkey at any given moment, it rests on a whole lot of other things. And I really don't think on this, and not on much else, did Israel have a grand design when it came to foreign policy. Sometimes I wish Israel did have a grand design on something. It doesn't usually.
Okay. Toda, Asher. Yusri, please mind the clock.
Okay, 2 minutes. I'm not talking about the grand plan. I'm talking about strategy. It was a strategy, and it reached its peak in 1982. There was a war outcome of this strategy. So I don't think it's only to exploit cases, because we have the Southern Sudan. So far, you have the Kurds in Iraq, the Druze in Israel, the Druze in Syria and Lebanon, the Maronite. So it's not exploiting cases. I think it's a matter of limitation. Israel never had the real resources to carry out this plan. It's not a matter of it's a matter of limitation more than something else. I have one okay. As We don't see intensive immigration of minority groups from the Middle East. The only case that I can indicate is the Christians. But we don't see intensive immigration from the Middle East, and also I don't think that minority groups in the Middle East facing existential threat, even during the Arab Spring. So it's important to put things in their place. I mean,
What about
the Yazidis and Christian, I say. Yeah, but we don't see intensive immigration of the Shia, the Druze, the Alawite. Yeah, but they are leaving Iraq. They are leaving Iraq.
We shall hear about it in the third session, I understand. Well, thanks to the panelists for their interesting presentations. Thanks to the audience for their attendance.